everyone, so Tony just proved you can love an economist. Great. So, yeah, I'm not so fierce on carbon taxes. Where did they come from? It's interesting. When Canada first sort of engaged nationally and provincially around climate change and started talking about what to do about it was 1988, 30 years ago. Back then I kind of looked like a guy who could run a craft brewery, you know, has black beard, hair, 30 years. 30 years have gone by, but we can't actually afford to have 30 years go by again without some dramatic changes like Tony was speaking about, like Louise was speaking about, because some very bad things are going to happen if we do not change our current trajectory. So in '88, we'd come out of a long battle to try and to successfully, in fact, stop acid rain. Interestingly enough, it was you know, a large regional problem caused mostly by sulfur emissions that not from local plants, but you know, atmospherically transported and coming down in the form of acid rain, killing lakes. So that was successfully solved through regulation, in fact. What was interesting about that was that two things. One was government ran, both levels of government ran a extensive campaign to build awareness and understanding in the public about what the problem was, what the solutions were, why they wanted to move in the direction they were moving. So they put a lot of effort into bringing people along to try and solve this problem, ensuring that they were building support as they went for solving that problem. And I guess in the environmental movement in 1988, we thought, well, Canada will likely take the same approach with addressing carbon pollution in terms of our share of tackling climate change. But they didn't. The first phase for a decade or so was buying industry's argument that we should have voluntary measures. Just let us do the right thing. We will do the right thing to cut carbon pollution from the industrial side. And that included the electrical utilities, which were largely publicly owned. That didn't happen. Then we got into a long and protracted debate about setting targets. So voluntary measures and no real action. We had a long debate about setting targets, mostly around the Kyoto Protocol at the time, and that resulted in no action. Just a law, another 10 years of debate, discussion, no action. And then along came market-based solutions. So carbon taxes, cap and trade, and that's what we're currently arguing about, mostly carbon taxes, as you know. And again, no actual action in terms of addressing climate change. So industry, big oil, that's successfully avoiding regulation since 1988. Could be a poster on carbon. And we're quite happy about that. So actually, it really, the real sort of push for cap and trade and carbon pricing came from big industry, from big oil, because they wanted tiny taxes to avoid regulation. And they thought that's the best deal. Avoid regulation, avoid costs associated with regulation, which became, over that period, to be known as command and control. Doesn't make you feel very good, right? If someone's going to exercise command over you and control you. It's not what we used to call public interest regulation. It wasn't command and control. It was, regulation in the public interest. So that's where we've come. And as Tony pointed out, with these tiny taxes, you get a tiny response. And looking at a paper that sort of reviewed 25 countries around the world using carbon pricing, on average, they cover about 50% of the emissions of those countries, on average. And on average, you see about a 4% reduction as a result of the price signal. So 4% is not very big. Well, let me say, what we need to do, which the others were pointing to, is make the energy transition. We need to move off of fossil fuels. We've got to phase out coal. We've got to leave shale gas in the ground. We've got to grow our use of production and use of renewable energy and so on. So how do you fund that? Well, that's where the interest in carbon pricing comes from our perspective, the Green Party, which was, well, there's a source of revenue to actually fund programs to help people and businesses shrink their carbon footprint by switching to green heating sources, by supporting the shift to zero-emission vehicles, to public transportation, to greening homes, reducing their energy consumption, and so on and so forth. Because where are you going to find the money for the energy transition? Well, you can find it out of the general revenue, which will have an overall impact on the need for all the other sort of sources of revenue in terms of taxation, or you have a dedicated price on carbon, specifically to generate the revenue that will be dedicated to helping people reduce their carbon emissions. So it's not the price itself, it's the revenue and how it's applied to help people and businesses shrink their carbon footprint. So that's kind of how we at the New Brunswick Green Party come at this notion. So that's why I say I'm not so furious about this. Because look, if you think back to Louise's pie chart, our big sources of greenhouse gas emissions in New Brunswick are electricity. We own the power company. We can tell it what to do. We don't need carbon taxes. We just need to tell them what to do. What they do is governed by an Electricity Act. It's a public company for a reason, otherwise it would be a private company. So it's a public company because it serves public interest, and clearly today, one of the clear issues of public interest is to ensure our power utility is moving us off of fossil fuels, that we're greening our grid and are supplying electricity from renewable sources. So we own them, so we can tell them what to do. So that's one. Industry. Well, the biggest source by far, and it wasn't in Louise's graph, but by far, it was on her table, or list, on the industrial emissions, outshadowing all the others, is the refinery. So about 3 million tons a year or something, compared to the rest, which are in the hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands. So regulate the emissions of the refinery. The thing about regulation, which I like, is, well, it is more expensive, arguably. You put the regulations in place, and you pay later. So, in the sense that you get the response, you get the emissions down, and yeah, it's going to have an impact on costs down the road. But it is far easier to get regulations in place than to get carbon pricing in place that's going to be of a size that's meaningful in any way. The kind of, and Tony put it up there, that the level of carbon pricing would be required to actually make significant impacts would be huge, and that would be a problem, I think, for most people. So the energy transition around heating and cooling, around power generation, around transportation, we've got to pay for it some way. Carbon pricing can provide revenue. But what the federal system has come up with is to just write us checks, give us the money back, or more. And some of that money will get used in ways that will actually increase people's carbon footprints. Putting it towards a trip. A lot of people will save it to go, for a trip, to take a flight somewhere. So that's lost my train of thought here. But anyway, so that's the key thing is the revenue. So our approach was and has been put a price on, to capture it all, put a price on where the carbon comes into the Brunswick's economy. So in other words, the coal that comes in to the port in Beldoon, the oil that comes in to, I know I said we can tell MB Power what to do, but this is sort of the theory. The oil that comes into the refinery, the gas that comes in through the pipeline. Put the price there, and yes, it trickles down, likely, although we wouldn't have to have it trickle down from where you put it on MB Power. And then turn that revenue back in the way of programming to help people and businesses reduce their carbon footprint in some of the ways that Tony had on his slide, as well as rebating the cost to low-income people, wherever you set the line. And that's the approach we've talked about. So it's not so much the carbon price itself is going to make much of a difference, but the revenue that it generates applied to programming that will help individuals, households, and businesses cut their carbon footprint would. So that's the long and short of how we think of the utility of carbon pricing. We haven't got that. As I said, I'm not fierce on it. In fact, 10 years ago when Stéphane Dion had his carbon shift, I tried to talk him out of it. We had this long conversation about, you know, doing this is just going to turn people off climate action because in many cases, you're not going to influence behavior, you're just going to be paying for it. So if someone's going to, you know, you've got a senior living in their family home with an oil furnace and they're getting a price on the oil that they're heating with, well, they're just going to pay more money. Maybe it gets rebated. Well, the new system will get rebated. Back then there was no talk of rebates, but you see what I mean. So it's got us down into this rabbit hole, once again, about avoiding climate action, arguing over climate pricing. Climate pricing or carbon taxes, carbon pricing or carbon taxes being regarded as the carbon plan. In the introduction, I mentioned, Tamara mentioned that I was part of the select committee on climate change. We went around the province, all-party committee, and held hearings. It was excellent what people were coming forward with, what they were proposing, the kinds of initiatives that people felt the government should be taking. And so we put together a series of recommendations based on what we heard. And that was then kind of distilled down into a strategy that the former government adopted a couple of years ago, eliminating some of what we recommended, but maintaining much of it. And they never implemented it. So they had a plan, but they didn't implement it. The current government has no plan at all, so far that I can tell. Maybe I'll learn more this week, but they're going to court, which I don't understand, because why do they need to do this? Saskatchewan and Ontario are already going to court. If Premier Higgs is so down on this, all he has to do is sit back and watch those guys spend their money. And if they're successful, great, he wins. If they're not, he still wins. Doesn't look like a fool for going to wasting our money on a legal case. So it defies explanation as to why he's participating, dragging us into this court case. But he is. So there you go. Anyway, that's my long and short of it on carbon pricing. Thank you.